Hello everybody and welcome back. As always, I am Mateo311 and this is your channel for everything VR related. Today, we're talking about how VR multiplayer games suck. Well, that's not exactly true. There are plenty of online VR games that I enjoy, but it is fairly common for VR titles to fail, underwhelm the VR community, or amazingly, even when they are still doing well, they somehow get cancelled. So let's break down all of the reasons why this is happening, the unique obstacles these games need to overcome, what we should expect from VR games in the future, and how no one has cracked the VR PvP formula just yet. Now, there are of course links and timestamps if you want to skip ahead, but before we jump in, this video is brought to you by VR Rock. VR Rock makes prescription lens inserts for all of your favorite VR headsets, and now they have them for the PlayStation VR too. So if you've been struggling to get your eyeglasses to fit inside the headset, or you're afraid you might scratch the lens, these can be a great option. They magnetically connect, so they're easy to put on and take right back off. And if you're interested, I have a 10% discount code down in the description and a link to their webpage. Before we break down the state of VR multiplayer games, let me know some of your favorite titles down in the comments and why you feel that way. We'll start with the most rock-solid reason that holds VR games back, and this includes all titles, not just multiplayer ones. VR development is harder than traditional flat-screen games for a multitude of reasons, plus these titles have smaller budgets and install bases. It's very common for VR developers to need to support multiple different platforms to make their title profitable. On the Quest, this includes the need for extensive optimization, which limits overall game complexity and can be quite time-consuming. As you move into PC VR, you not only have to support multiple different headsets, but also a large array of hardware configurations. For one reason or another, there's usually a headset that just doesn't play nice with a specific game. And when it comes to the PlayStation VR, development may be the easiest from the hardware standpoint, but Sony likes to make studios jump through a lot of hoops before they can officially release their games. You also need to avoid any platform-specific features so that you won't have any issues supporting crossplay. So there's clearly a lot of different platform-specific issues that developers need to deal with. But another big hit to VR multiplayer games is the fact that the player base is just much smaller. Online games live and die by their communities, and not only is VR niche, but portions of it are already dying off. The Rift, Rift S, and Quest have been discontinued, and while the Quest 1 is only 4 years old, most of the online games that originally had support for it no longer do. This includes titles like Onward, Population 1, Blast On, VR Chat, and so on. While only a small portion of the online community is still using legacy hardware, this is still a blow to the industry and erodes player confidence. With VR multiplayer game after game shutting down, most players refuse to jump ship from their favorite title unless the game offers something new and exciting or is a huge bang for the buck. Now, value, high production, and a brand new unique experience are all hard to come by, especially with the budgetary constraints we see in the VR industry. There's only so much risk or how far out of the norm you could push before no one's willing to help fund your title. Compounding that issue is some multiplayer titles failed hard simply because they were ahead of their time. This includes great games like Space Junkies, Hover Junkers, Raw Data, and one of my personal favorites, Swords of Gura. They all had excellent VR mechanics, but not the needed install base to keep them up and running. Now, a unique issue that the VR industry faces is attempting to chase flat screen titles. There's this notion that everything is just better in VR, a sentiment that I do not agree with at all. Again, those hardware and budgetary limitations kick in, and games that try to emulate a flat screen experience end up giving us something much shallower. One example is Alva, which feels like Call of Duty from 10 years ago. It's by no means a bad game, but when you stack it up against a modern flat screen shooter, it just doesn't compare, and graphically it's severely dated. Larcenauts is another good example, which barely felt like a VR title at launch. The notion of taking flat screen game XYZ and bringing it into VR just doesn't always work. Now, if you don't believe me, look at some of the most successful VR titles such as Beat Saber, Boneworks, and Blade and Sorcery. They succeed by prioritizing VR and give you an experience that you can't get on flat screen. But these are all primarily single-player games, and when it comes to multiplayer, no one's really cracked the code just yet. There are some excellent attempts like Population 1, Blast On, Walkabout Mini Golf, and Echo VR, which all feature at least some mechanics that wouldn't work on flat screen, but even then, we're still lacking a blockbuster title like Call of Duty. Now, there are some exceptions such as Pavlov, which found success due to multiple reasons. For starters, it delivers an experience that people were looking for, and it was the first of its kind. While it's mostly just a Counter-Strike clone with added motion controls, unlike most VR titles, it's not really a downgrade from the flat screen experience. And this title also has the added benefit of offering up so much content. But another aspect to look into is something like VR fatigue. VR gamers consume content in a vastly different manner than traditional gamers, so these games will have to adjust accordingly. It's one thing to deal with a high level of complexity when all you're working with is a gamepad in your hands. Scale this up to full body immersion with motion controls, and it can easily become overwhelming for your average player. It might also be too exhausting for long-term play. So you end up with a level of intensity and complexity that turns off the average gamer, especially when they're in a competitive situation. Now the solution there is usually to scale back mechanics or focus on co-op instead. That'll end up alienating the hardcore portion of the VR community. This is definitely a unique new situation for VR developers, and no one has been able to fully crack the code just yet. Now if you went back in time 5 or so years and tried to explain Beat Saber to people, it probably wouldn't make any sense at all. It's hard to explain how that title is so uniquely suited for VR, and I doubt anyone ever predicted how good it could truly be. So it feels like right now we're waiting on the Beat Saber of VR multiplayer games. Now I'm not sure we know the form that that'll take on. I'm intrigued by something like Dungeon Full Dive, because once again, that is an experience that you just can't get on flat screen. To be able to go from playing a tabletop game and then instantly dropping into that world and living it is uniquely VR. Is that the type of addictive gameplay loop we're waiting for? Or is it something completely different? It's extremely hard to come up with a VR multiplayer game that has a massive mainstream appeal. You start with a community that's already pretty niche, and then just keep chopping it down more and more. Some people are not a fan of PvP or competition. Others will never play a shooter. Those who do play shooters may consider themselves hardcore and want excessive violence and hardcore mechanics. By the time you settle on a concept, you've already cut out a vast majority of the VR population, and it only gets much worse if your game is platform exclusive. This is why a title like Veil failed, and why other games like Onward have a small but very committed community. VR just either doesn't have the player base or can't figure out how to make the multiplayer game that the majority of us enjoy. Now there are a few other games that are on the way that I can't discuss yet, but they do have the potential to shake things up. I still don't believe we've solved the multiplayer conundrum just yet, but things like the PlayStation VR 2, Quest 3, and other upcoming hardware should definitely help. Now this was just my opinion, and some of these topics are quite subjective, so let me know what you think down in the comments right now.
And that was today's video, brought to you by my dad, Mateo311. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you're new here,
Consider subscribing.
consider
Consider subscribing.
consider subscribing.
Consider subscribing.
Consider subscribing.
We'll see you guys on next time.
We'll see you guys on next time.